but my name is Kate Fawson, and I'm the founder at Brand Pollinators. And we support purpose-driven emerging brands to help them scale and work together so that they can make a bigger impact. And today we have our guest for our community call, Mia Medina. She is from Gather Brands, which is a full-service sales consulting agency that's focused on women-owned businesses, specifically in the CPG industry. And Mia has a lot of experience working in sales, and she's worked with some really large national distributed brands, but also launched a few of her own CPG companies. So she is a great resource for people looking to get into retail, and we're going to have, I think, a great conversation today and learn a lot about the process. So thanks, Mia, for joining us. Oh, shoot, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here to talk to some of these amazing brands and founders. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing. So thank you for bringing everyone together. That's one of my passions of what we're doing. And I think you and I share that similarly. So I appreciate the work that you do with the brands. And I'm excited to be here. I can just give a short history if that's helpful, or if we can get right in, whatever you prefer.
Yeah. Why don't you give us a little more background?
Yeah. I started my career in the natural products industry about 25 years ago, and I worked with NS Sales for my entry into there. I ended up managing the Northern California division, moved on to Odwalla, the juice company. So learned a completely different method, DSD distribution. From there, my husband and I actually inadvertently started a distribution company. There's a much longer story around that one, but we ended up having basically sort of being Whole Foods national solution to a DSD partner, where we worked with emerging brands as well as perishable cold box items and things like that. But that's really where my passion for emerging brands came from. It was the work that I did there and working really closely with each of the foragers in the regions to help identify, brands that, we're looking to get into retail and then scale them. And then from there, we launched our own soda line, which we still have. And then I went back into the sales consulting world, and I worked for an agency for about 1.5 years. And then my position was eliminated during COVID. And so I thought, this was pre-Great Resignation. So I thought, what better time for me to sort of get back to my roots and work with some of these emerging brands and really focus on some of those, the underrepresented, brands. Yes, female found was the primary focus when we started, although we are not, exclusionary. So we don't want to say that we won't work with any brands. We want to help sort of bridge that connection for, when these products are amazing, they have these amazing products. I feel like women do create products out of purpose and passion. And a lot of times that missing piece is just how to get it on the shelf. And so that's kind of where we come in and really help brands scale. And so it can be, any stage of brand where I always say it could be pre-revenue or pre-retail. We actually have a lot of brands that came over from direct to consumer, where they had an amazing D2C business. So they were pre-retail, but they might have had been doing anywhere from 3 to 8 million on D2C. So all stages of brands, but really excited to be here and chat, and happy to answer any questions that any of you may have. Sorry, I've got my friend. This is this was my foster fail during COVID. And so I've got him here with me today. And so you might hear a little whining. I don't have, but anyway, that's whiskey.
Pet friendly here. So that's fun. So really, Gather Brands has only been around for like 3 years.
Yeah, we launched in August of 2020.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. And these are some of your brands that you have on the shelf behind you.
Yep. Yeah.
That is so cool.
Yeah, so it's really fun. We're a team of 9, about to be soon to be 10. We work really closely with our brands. So we are much more of a sales consulting agency versus your traditional broker. I think a lot of times brokers act as sort of that liaison between retailers and brands, where we really are an extension to our brands team. So we do a lot of the onboarding paperwork. We do, a lot of things that a lot of brokers just sort of shift in between. We also work closely on, cost of doing business within each of the retailers and what makes the most sense and, for brands budgets and things like that.
Mm. So if you're talking with like a brand that is just starting to get into retail, I mean, what are some things that you would suggest that they have in place, or maybe certain milestones that they've met before they decide to like go full on into those stores?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think a lot of times there's a misconception that you have to have a distributor before you go into retail, but that's actually not the case. You can do things at the same time, because working towards gaining that distribution is possible when you might, you get an anchor account. I think the most important thing to have in place is your pricing, and knowing where where you are with your pricing, and that you have the margins for the retailers and the distributor. And, I think a lot of people sometimes say, well, I'm going to price it because I know, a year from now when I'm ordering more, that my costs will go down. But what happens is some brands, depending on if they're invested in or not, if they're bootstrapped, but what happens is when you do that, your cost of your labels and your packaging and everything goes up. So that can create a total cash flow crunch, if you're sort of pricing things for what they might be one day. So
Right.
I advise against that. And I think that really having a good understanding of your pricing and your margins is really important. And
Yeah.
that's something we actually work with brands. We do work with them in the early stages, depending on if they, we work with getting them set up on that, and figuring out what those what that pricing is. And you might realize you're going to have to hit the shelves higher than you wanted to, or you might say, you know what, I'm going to pause and take a step back and maybe try and build up my D2C business, or, Amazon, whatever that might be.
Yeah. And I think there's another piece that I wasn't aware of initially, is that there are a lot of these hidden costs, or like there's certain retailers that want you to do promotions regularly or sales regularly. And if you don't have those margins built in early on, then you're going to be
Yeah,
constantly discounting off of a price that you already can't afford.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that happen before, and it's just like so frustrating because you think you have a decent margin, and then it's like, oh, you have to go on buy one get one this month.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
month.
And you can definitely push back. I think that's one of the important things, is knowing, there are going to be certain accounts that you might not see that ROI in, and you might, look at that as a marketing expense, right? So some of the more like, I won't name names, but certain types of accounts that are in LA that really focus on, um, it's tough. It's really expensive to do business with, but it's one of those things where, people have this sort of, it's a cachet. And so the brands want to be in there, but it's really important to look at what that cost of doing business is. And I think the other thing to remember is that your first year of sort of when you're entering a market is going to be your highest as far as trade spend goes, because you're really promoting to get on the shelf, right? You're going to show that buyer, yes, I'm going to do quarterly promotions, and I'm going to do 3 flyers, whatever it is. It's going to cost more. But once you're on shelf, and let's, assuming you're moving on shelf, the next year you might not have to promote so heavily because you've got good velocities. And so it's, a lot, that's where it's at, first year is always going to be a tough one. So it doesn't mean that that's going to be the same moving forward every year.
Mm-hmm. And to your point about, some places are more expensive than others, like how should brands decide which retailers they should pursue? Because I
Mhm.
think that's like, they're different, and it matters which ones you go for.
Yeah, I think it's going to come down to what their product is, right?
Mm.
If your product is much more, natural, sort of facing with or all of your certifications and things like that, I would definitely focus more on those sort of natural retailers where your primary consumer is shopping. It might be that, you don't have any of your certifications, but you're natural, so to say, then, specialty is a good way to go with, some of the more not necessarily hardcore. So I look at like Jimbo's as a hardcore natural, retailer, versus Gelson's, which is, more specialty, where, you'll see that they actually have Diet Coke, but then they also have, a lot of these really premium brands that are organic and non-GMO certified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's important to think about the customers who are shopping there, because I think sometimes brands are looking to expand their audience. And so maybe getting into, a specialty or even a kind of a more mainstream grocery might be the way to go if they're looking to kind of expand. But again, if their price is high, it might be
Exactly.
challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's where it really does, if you're more of a specialty, or excuse me, specialized, with, premium product with a higher price point than, some of those higher end locations that are, that your consumers are shopping in make more sense.
And then in terms of getting set up with a retailer, I mean, how long does that process take, or does it depend on the retailer?
It really depends on the retailer, but actually, more importantly, it's going to come down to the distributor. If they're going to require you to use a distributor, which, I would say probably 80% of the products out there are health and beauty, which is, HBC, sometimes can go direct. And there are some retailers that will allow you to go direct. They're few and far in between. But the sort of the setup is really going to depend on the distributor. So we've had brands that we've launched into retailers where we had a setup completed in 2 weeks. That's unheard of. We also had one where it took 6 months, and it was really frustrating because the retailer was ready to go, the brand was ready to go, everything was dialed. But unfortunately, the distributor was holding everything up, and that was at a different time. I think they were in a shift. The distributor was having a lot of personnel and internal stuff happening, but that's not the norm. But again, it's just something to look out for.
Yeah, for sure. Because it's not even like, I mean, once like there's that whole lead up to when you can actually get agreement from the retailer
Right.
too, right? So
Right.
there's like that whole added process as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so I imagine with Gather, you guys help support that relationship and kind of make those connections.
Exactly. And I think that's the one. It's not impossible for brands to go and sell into these stores. There's kind of two ways of doing it, right? You can go and sell into independents in and around where you are in your backyard. I think that used to be sort of the primary thing, and it is important to own your backyard. But with D2C being so big now, sometimes you might find that your core market for your product isn't actually where you are. And, there might be something else driving that. But I think that, you can go to your independent accounts and really kind of build out that story, get an idea of your velocities, understand how they're selling there. Those independent accounts also are usually a lot less expensive to do business with and promote with, where a lot of times they might compress margins. The issue with that is it can become a game of whack-a-mole. So you're supposed to have 30 independent accounts before, a distributor will open a DC, 20 to 30. So by the time you've gotten your 30th account approval, you go back to your first one and you're like, okay, we're ready to submit a turnover order. And that buyer maybe is now working in frozen or over at Whole Foods or, so what we really primarily focus on are really anchor accounts, and anchor accounts are accounts that will activate a distribution center. So it makes, that's one approval that you get. So there might be, and it might not be a 30 store anchor chain, but they might pull in a volume that they will anchor for that distribution center. And so those relationships are the relationships that we really focus on. And then we work with our distributor reps and brands as well, because some of our brands might say, okay, I'm going to get an ambassador to help do the independents while we're launching into, these anchor accounts.
Yeah. And so in working with independents, I've seen that before, where it's like, it definitely whack-a-mole is a good explanation for that, because I feel like it's hard to juggle all of those separate pieces of what each store is doing individually and ordering, like I worked a long time ago, but I mean, some of them are still using like faxes to take orders. And
Yes,
stuff.
totally. To submit turnover orders.
Yes. But I mean, do you think that it's like, what's kind of the tipping point, do you think, for brands that are working with those smaller independents or like focusing on their own backyard to then going to bigger anchor accounts or national accounts? I mean, is there like a time when you would say, okay, yeah, definitely now you want to go for it? Or
it's funny because I always say it never hurts to submit, right? So if you're looking at a larger account, you can submit to a Whole Foods, a Sprouts. Those are the long game, right? Like you really need to have your ducks in order. I just shared a post. As I said, we launched a soda line. I've submitted for 5 years to Sprouts, and we just got, approved. So I know I speak from experience. Yet I also see brands that, launched last year and they get immediate approval. It just depends. Beverage is a hard category, so I think it's really important. You could, but I think what is important is that you submit, because then you're on their radar. You might get declined. And, I always say most likely you will. I love when we don't. I love when our brands get approved. But I tell brands plan on it, because there's so much other business we can go after. So, there's a lot of other opportunities that you can really utilize to build out that program and show what your velocities are. So then you can take that on your second submission. And then, maybe the buyer from one of the larger accounts was saying, wow, I really liked this brand, but I didn't want to necessarily take a chance on it. And now I love seeing that their velocities are strong and I see that they're in the market. And so you've built that story, but you were already on their radar. So I think it's, you can apply. The other thing is that if you apply and you get approved, you don't always have to move forward. You might decide, obviously, the most important thing is that, when you're working with that retailer, you don't drag that on, because that retailer has agreed to bring you in place of maybe somebody else. But it might not be the right time. Things might have changed from when you submitted. That's also a long process, so it's always a good idea to submit. But I think that, just really knowing your business and being able to, really build out that program with some of those smaller accounts makes a lot of sense, and really helps your story when you do go into the bigger accounts.
And I would think that like velocity is probably one of the best measures for tracking your progress, even with those independent accounts.
Yeah. And that can be really hard to do if you aren't paying for the data from the distributor. So, maybe starting out with smaller regional distributors, while you're getting into some of the independent accounts, if you choose to go that way first, is a great idea, because they also share their, again, speaking from experience, when we owned our distribution company, we wanted our brands to know what accounts we were servicing, because we wanted them to drive sales within those accounts. We wanted them to, schedule demos and go in there and meet and greet and do all those things. So, so the smaller ones will usually share that data, where the larger ones won't. You just, you don't really have visibility. What you've sold into, but if anybody else is pulling it in, you don't have visibility to that unless you pay for it.
Yeah. And that's like, isn't that going to be one of the determining factors of whether you stay on the shelf at the store? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I've seen this before, where like you get into a really big retailer with a lot of doors, but if the product's not moving, like they'll totally just X you out.
Yeah, after paying a lot and slotting and all of that, I think and that's why I always tell brands, it's quality over quantity. It's not about how many doors you're in. It's about being in the right doors. And I think, Central Market and H-E-B is a really good example. Some brands are like, I want to go in H-E-B. There's, they have X number of doors. Central Market is 10 stores. You can get a really good idea in Central Market of, especially because they're super creative and they're, you'll do more volume in those 10 stores than maybe 100 H-E-Bs, depending on your product, right? Obviously, it totally depends on the product. But it's really about being in the right stores and not just being in as many. I like to, we like to focus and go, a mile deep and an inch wide.
Yeah. Well, and it makes me think too about like sort of more regional or localized like marketing support around those as well, because it seems like if you really want to prove that velocity, you have to make sure that people in the region know where to buy the product and that they're coming back and that kind of thing.
Yep.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, have you seen or participated in any like collaborations with retailers in terms of promoting products in certain areas or anything like that? Because like, for instance, I saw the other day, I think it was I1 Organics had a billboard with Fresh Market. And it had their product and the Fresh Market logo, and it was in a specific city or whatever. So I'm curious, have you seen any of that kind of thing?
Yeah, typically that's one of those. It's either an end cap or it just depends on like, oh, you're talking about an actual billboard.
Yeah, an actual billboard.
Okay.
Yeah.
I haven't seen too many of those. It depends. I think it just depends on how you collaborate with the marketing department, because that's kind of even a separate step than your buyer. So getting on shelf and then doing those, external programs. I think what is more common is sort of, in store, whether it's an end cap or things like that. We actually had a program with Earth Fair for March where we did a women's history, and it was gather brands and then a select few of our brands on end caps in the Earth Fare stores. That's fun to do. I think the other thing for brands to do is, and we try and do this, but if you brands and I love that there's such camaraderie out there between brands, but maybe you guys go in on an end cap together. It's expensive. So if you have, a chip brand and somebody who's got a beverage and you're both in that retailer, hey, we want to split this, or, that kind of thing. I think that that's a good way to save money, but still get great product placement. That collaboration is always fun.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're all about doing collaborations with the Brand Pollinators community, and we've been working a lot on different ideas and opportunities coming up this year. And I love the idea of sharing an end cap.
Yeah,
That's really cool. And we've also
we
talked
do
about
that a lot with our brand partners. We'll
yeah.
split them. Mhm.
Well, and I've seen you guys had for like I guess the second year in a row the booth at Expo where you have all the brands at your booth. So
Yeah,
that's really cool. I love
yeah,
being
that's
able.
fun.
That's awesome. So in terms of one of the questions I had, and if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to chime in. I'm just sort of going down a list of things that I came up with based on questions people have asked me. But when it comes to like the relationships with the buyers and things like that, is that something that your area of expertise is, or is that something that people kind of need to manage on their own? How does that work?
No, I think it's really hard for founders to manage all the relationships on their own, right? Like it's a slow build. And again, this has to, could depend on timing of budgets, constraints, things like that. But that is exactly sort of what you're getting with not just us, but, any other broker, sales, consulting agencies, is really those relationships that are already standing and already in place. We know all of the processes for submissions, and we know all of the cost of doing business for each of the accounts. So it's like that's kind of the purpose of that, is going to somebody. And then that also allows you as the founder to really focus on sort of a little bit, higher level, getting your margins, better and getting cost of ingredients down and working on that stuff while, we or anybody else you work with works as your sales team. And then we report in, and it's like, here's where we are. Here's, our account status, that kind of thing. I think that's why communication is really probably one of the most important things with fractional and outside sales teams. I've structured mine specifically based on sort of this really, I feel like broker can be a bad word sometimes. We can get somewhat of a bad rap. And it's understandable. I think that, when you have these massive agencies with hundreds of brands, it is hard for a smaller brand to get that attention. So, but I think communication with an external sales team, or, fractional, whatever you want to call it, is so important.
Oh, yeah. Okay. We have I have a question. Hassan, did you have a question?
Yes, I have lots of questions. So thank you for joining me. This is amazing. Very serendipitous for us, because we were dealing with the things that we were talking about. So I think to give a little bit of context to the group and we're an olive oil brand that we have 3 pillars. So peace, planet, and olives. For peace, we harvest from conflict zones all around the world, but we started in Cyprus to nurture family farms in those zones to nurture peace. The second is that we have our aluminum bottle launching, and basically olives is. Sorry, I'm a little excited. I'm a little nervous.
That's okay.
But long story short, so in terms of context, we're about 500 stores of Whole Foods nationwide, and Whole Foods we're looking to expand. We're kind of a little anxious just to stay in Whole Foods. And I think my first question, given that context, is what do you think the next right doors are for us, or what is exactly the next 3 ones to have that buyer relationship? Because Whole Foods can be a little cold in terms of like getting back and forth. We think, and we try a couple of methods that have a leverage on velocity. I'm seeing single and fat on the background. So I'm not sure if you have a conflict of interest, but one of the questions is,
Fine.
what are the small doors velocity? Like how much are they like preaching on velocity or like sort of gating the brands on velocity? I think those were my first questions. And I have a couple more.
Yeah, I think those are great questions, by the way. And congratulations on your national launch in Whole Foods. That's really awesome. So I think that, that it's kind of a two-part. The first question of, what are the next retailers that you should be looking at? I think it comes down to, where are you based?
So we're based in Europe, but we travel back and forth. Yeah. So
I think it would be really sort of picking, one or two markets of, where, and do you have D2C business? Direct to consumer?
Not as strong, not strong, meaning like almost negligible. The ones in the list that we saw, he's my co-founder as well. So
I'm Jamura. So in the US, we made the B2B start with Whole Foods, to be honest.
Which is awesome. And that's what I usually tell people. I'm like, please don't think this is the normal way to go to market. So congratulations. We've had a couple of brands launch that way too. And I think it's getting a little bit, again, with that D2C, if a brand's got a presence, or if, there's something, you guys clearly have something that was, and I know Whole Foods does appreciate sort of all of, with the piece and the planet, all of that is really important. So what I would do is probably look at where your markets are largest within that Whole Foods business and say, that makes sense to really kind of expand out within those markets while you get the other ones, up and running. What's nice about Whole Foods is obviously you have your own portal, so you can track and view all of your sales at the store level, which is amazing. And really take that information to other retailers and say, look, this is, we've got a consumer base here in this market. We're doing really well within Whole Foods. Depending on your price points, without knowing, too much of that information, I would say probably natural specialty focus if that's kind of still online, in line with sort of that Whole Foods. But there might be some, like I said, if your price point can withstand it, then maybe you look at a couple of conventional retailers within those markets as well. There's nothing, again, you have a very crossover product, so it's something that can be, the multiple uses. It's not like you're an adaptogenic beverage, or they can be a little bit more, pigeonholed. So I would look at it from a market perspective and how well you're doing within each of the regions of Whole Foods.
Okay. We are mostly Midwest focused.
So so to give a little specificity on that is like New York is very big, Southwest, which were we thought central market for a long time. Chicago, Illinois is big for us, and California.
Yep. I will say that obviously Northeast and California are always usually the biggest markets for brands, just by sheer numbers of population, right? It's that there's got more people shopping in their stores. They're also more competitive. So, depending on how far you're varying, it might be, maybe the Midwest does make sense, or maybe Northeast and Midwest, or, you know what I mean? Just looking at the sort of how your pie chart sits with regard to each of the regions.
Would it make easier for us being in Whole Foods in those doors? Like, let's say Chicago is our biggest city. What would that relationship, like how long do you think it will take for someone in like a retailer in Chicago or Midwest region?
Yeah, it just depends on, it could come down to a category review schedule if they're open review. So I assume you're getting to Whole Foods via UNFI. Yeah. So that's the other thing I would look at as well, as who else in those markets is pulling from UNFI, because you want to, continue to build those velocities throughout that distribution center as well. So it might come down to category review schedules. Whole Foods has actually the longest one as far as terms of when you present versus when it hits the shelf. So it might be, a couple of months, but like I said, I think if you take some of that data of how well you're doing within those stores, It could be anywhere from 2 months, again, you're already active. So if they're a UNFI account, it's just a matter of that buyer turning it on and, setting it up in their system to bring it in, which makes it a lot easier, which is why we focus so much on those sort of anchor accounts, because once you've got those codes for both UNFI and or KE, it makes the selling process that much simpler.
Just for the group, like it took us a year and a half and maybe some change to when we first started, like very, very, very first meeting. Another like very much more neutral question that we're trying to decide the sample boxes for buyers. So we thought of preparing these because the next team is always like, oh, send me a box.
Yep.
Pretty much. What did in those scenarios, should it be shiny as we could make it, like all the bells and whistles, or what would you like to see as a buyer in those boxes?
I think it's always really nice when there is a very concise, sort of, it used to be like a PR box, or, where it's like one SKU of each sample, but again, without understanding, without breaking the bank. But I think when you have, I've got one, we did them for Wave where, we've got 6 cans in there, and then it was, a pretty fold up box. I think you definitely don't need to send cases anymore. I think that's kind of the old school. They don't want it. They don't want all that product. And you definitely don't want to send it without them requesting or, approving you send the samples. But I think it's really nice when you have something that you can open up and you see whatever, however many SKUs you have, one of each of those. And then, I think those are great, but I think they're also really costly. I don't necessarily know that that's going to be the deciding factor for anybody. You know what I mean?
It seems like you probably don't want them in like a little unmarked jar though either, right? Like it has to.
Well, no, I think he's talking about the delivery of the labeled package. It's already, it's right.
Like,
You're talking about sort of like those PR boxes where you can make them pretty, or you can just, wrap them in bubble wrap and send them as well. I do love those. I think they're great. I think it also shows that you're a little bit further along, because that's not something that, a brand is really going to start doing from day one. So that's nice, where it could be like, okay, they've got their, they've definitely got their stuff together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, because we have the sustainability claim, we were a bit in 2 minds.
Yeah.
I was a bit for, let's not print on the boxes. Let's just do a masking tape seal that can be personalized according to the buyer, and if it will be an e-com sale. And that way it is both sustainable and pretty. He was all about like, oh, that we need to print on the boxes, we need to make it an experience. And I was like, at the end of the day, it will be on a shelf in the retailer. So the buyer, it won't be their main concern. Like,
yeah.
So,
and that's hard. And I remember actually reading an article about this with Honest. And I actually was, I would get subscriptions of diapers from Honest. And part of that was, was what they talked about was sort of this whole experience, and how you would, there was a message on every single flap, and maybe if it's just your sample kits that you send to people, that's a good idea. But I do agree that to have that on every single case is not necessarily sustainable, because, if it's going to the distributor, if they're breaking it open, depending on how they're selling it or who's opening it, it's, maybe somebody who's doing the stocking and it's not even reaching the consumer. So, I think there's different levels that you might want to do something like that from a marketing perspective.
okay.
Yeah, we'll keep those two separate, because like we don't want to.
Yeah.
I think one of the last, I think it'll come up at a certain point, but I'm more of the direct one out of the duo is like, if we were to work with like Gather, like what are the sort of fee structures that you have for brands trying to expand or starting anew?
Yeah, because so many of our brands are just starting out, we usually have a retainer structure, and it just varies by regions. But we also have a commission structure. So if we have a larger brand come on board, where it's already, there's more, it's established, then we can do commission. It just depends on what that looks like. And so, so that's kind of how we're set up, because so many of our brands are in these really early stages. A lot of that legwork is done, which is why we have a retainer earlier on. And then we really work to build to that commission structure.
The commission is tailored to each brand?
No, well, it just depends on where, because we have different regions. So depending on what regions you're coming on for and what your, revenue is within each of the regions. So 5% is a standard commission, but it just depends on the regions and how that breaks out.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Is there any other questions came up? Thank you, Hassan. Those are really good questions. Along those lines, oh wait, hold on. Did somebody? Okay. Along those lines of, I was just thinking about like other things that brands might need to do to prepare to get into retail. So, obviously having some sample boxes is great for buyers, but I know you mentioned the pricing, like, is there a certain amount of inventory brands should have? Like, what are some other things that they might need to prepare before they get into a new retailer?
That's a really great question. I think that one of the things that is the most important, aspects, it's like basically your pricing. So a spec sheet that has your pallet configuration, so your case, all of that information with pricing, UPC codes, something like that. And then a sell sheet is it's awesome. That's great. And then definitely samples, because what happens is the first thing, when we sign on with a brand, we always send out an introduction, even if it's not the review time for that category. But let's just say they had somebody fall through and the buyer says, can I get some samples right now? Then we're ready to go with that. And I think that's usually the first question, is people want to, see the samples and try it if they're going to move forward. So as far as quantities, it just depends. It depends on if you're looking at trying to sell some product into independents first and try and go direct, or if you're just waiting to get, to sort of see where you end up with these category review cycles, then it's more a matter of having enough, products on hand for, let's say 150 accounts, right? If that's what you want to do. So you could definitely do a small run. The other thing that I think brands can do, it's sort of in reference to your stock bottle that you said, Kate, where it doesn't always have to be perfect if you have a really good rendering and your product's not ready yet. We don't prefer that. And I think you have to look at, putting your best forward, and you only get, what is that expression? There's only one chance for a first impression or something. So you want to do that, but it's not unheard of to not have, the complete package, as long as what's inside is what is going to be on the shelf. And you have a really nice rendering to go along with it. Let's just say if you couldn't get your samples done by May and your category review was in May, then that's when we could do that. But we don't recommend that, but it's totally not unheard of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. And then once the buyer does accept the product and they can get it on shelves, like, what are some ways that you suggest brands to ensure that they can keep their products on the shelves? Like, how can they help support those velocities?
Yeah, I think for us, whenever we present to a retailer, we actually have a promotional proposal that we bring with us. And so it's adhering to that, because chances are they've approved you based on, sort of knowing that you're going to be promoting. I think demos, they're really hard and they're expensive, but they're really important, because you can sell a lot of product, and making sure you're demoing at the right time, and that kind of thing. And I think that's the other piece of it, where some retailers are better partners than others. And some will look at that and say, well, they've really done a lot here. So they're, definitely on the chopping block, but I'm going to give them another chance, and some are just like, these numbers aren't there and you're out. So I think really, and then any social media on your end of things, how can you drive consumers into those retailers? For brands with large D2C mailing lists, send that out to the people that have ordered from you that live in those regions and things like that. So really partnering with them, and then, working with the retailer's marketing team. Do you qualify for any extra call outs? Is it, non-GMO? Is it vegan? Things like that you can, request having put on your shelf tags as well, because everybody, if you're on the shelf next to everybody and you have a specific call out, then your tag is going to stand out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great point. And yeah, I think there's so much nuance to what's going to work in different areas. But yeah, like you said, I mean, you got to put the effort in, and that may help make a difference, even if it's not necessarily increasing velocities immediately, can show that you're willing to put the legwork in. But yeah, I think demos is a great recommendation, because not only can you get people to actually taste the product, if it's a food, obviously, but you can also hear back from customers that, you know, have some feedback. Like if somebody spits it out, okay, there's feedback, you know.
And another way to make demos more affordable is to split it, like again, with an, you know, and you can split that with another brand, and, you know, then you're paying half the cost of the demo.
Yeah, for sure. I know. I'm just looking at who's on the call here, like who can do
right.
and something else. Yeah, no, that's a great recommendation. I love being able to find ways that the brands can kind of work together to tackle some of these things that might be a bigger expense if they were just doing it on their own. So let's see. Do we have any other questions here? Anybody have any other questions? No? Okay, well, I will, I think we'll just wrap it up unless anybody has any other questions, or Mia, do you have any other advice for brands that are looking to get into, oh, hold on, Hassan. We've got another question. Go ahead, Hassan.
Just quickly, as a brand who launched during the pandemic, we never get to do demos, and us being in Europe for the harvest, like production most of the year, it makes it a bit hard for us, because obviously we want to personally come to States, do them first ourselves, get our head around it, and then train a team, etc. Do you think samples work as nicely? Because Whole Foods recently just launched other marketing programs, and one of them is again costly, but you can put a sample in their online orders. Do you think that will be as effective, or nothing beats demos in terms of?
I mean, I'd have to see, you know, without knowing, you know, how is that through the Amazon program? Is that what you're talking about? With
both the store pickups and Amazon program.
Yep. I mean, I think it's great. I think the thing about the demos is that you have that interaction, right? And so a lot of times the samples, if they don't actually, that's, you know, not something that they're interested in, are they even going to try it? Are they going, you know what I mean? Like, so I think the demos are great. I think that if you can't, you know, and you don't have to be there for the demos, just so you know, like, I think Whole Foods does a really good job. I think there's a lot of third-party demo companies as well. Some retailers, you know, want you to just do their program where you don't get to say, some of them are really good and some of them aren't, you know. But I think that, you know, depending on the cost, I would compare the costs. And if it's more cost effective to do the samples to start out, I would try that and see how it goes. And then, you know, look into what that demo program could look like, because I know that they do have a pretty elaborate program right now.
Before we go, like, we're going to email you. Is the single and fat going to be a conflict of interest for us in terms of
it depends. We can definitely talk about it. We really, it's funny, I come from two schools of thought. You know, I understand where brands don't want to have competitive products in their category. I also, having been a distributor, we used to carry multiple competitive programs because we then could control that set. And so it really actually helped us to have more brands to put in there. We weren't going to, you know, not like we were going to take somebody else's out, not our own. So it just depends on, I usually would have a conversation with both brands and see how that is. We don't typically work with competing brands, but like I said, if there's a big enough differentiation, and maybe there's an interest in different regions or something like that, I'm always open to the conversation.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mia. It's such great information, and I hope you all got some of your questions answered today.
Awesome. And yeah, feel free to reach out. I'm here. I'm happy to answer any other questions if something comes to mind after the call. But thank you so much, Kate, for creating this amazing, you know, sort of resource for these brands to gather. And thanks so much for having me on the call. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And for anyone, if you have further questions, you can email me, or I know Mia's on LinkedIn. My email I'll share here, Kate at Brand Pollinators. And you can also check out brandpollinators.com. If you're not on our email list, I highly recommend it. We send out a lot of grants you can apply for, and upcoming events and marketing advice. So hopefully you'll find some use there. And then also we're launching a collaboration portal where brands can find ways to collaborate together. So we'd love to have you join that, and really appreciate you being here and all the work that you're doing. Thank you so much.